The adoption papers were signed with a flourish, a final, hopeful gesture in a life that had felt increasingly empty. After years of longing for a child, the arrival of Samir felt like a miracle. He was a quiet, solemn boy of 7 years, with eyes that held depths far beyond his years. The agency said he was from a remote region, a child of displacement and loss. We were told he was special, sensitive. They didn't say he was a vessel. The first weeks were a delicate dance. Samir spoke little, but his presence filled the house in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. He would stare at the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, not with childish wonder, but with a focus that seemed to command their movement. I once saw a spider, trapped in a sink, crawl effortlessly up the sheer porcelain wall after Samir glanced at it. He didn't smile, he just observed. Then came the whispers, not from him, but around him. At night, after I tucked him in, I'd hear a low, murmuring dialogue from his room. It sounded like multiple voices, arguing, conferring, in a language that was both ancient and fluid. When I'd open the door, Samir would be asleep, or pretending to be, and the room would be silent except for the faint, electric hum that now seemed to permanently reside there. The changes were subtle at first. My reflection in the mirror would sometimes hold a shadow not my own, a taller, sharper silhouette behind me, vanishing when I turned. Photographs of Samir would develop with faint, smoky anomalies in the background, like figures watching from a mist. He began to ask questions no child should know, about the composition of stars, the true names of forgotten gods, the binding properties of certain metals. One evening, during a thunderstorm, the power went out. I lit candles, their flames casting long, trembling shadows. Samir sat at the kitchen table, drawing, not with crayons, but with a fine layer of ash he had gathered from the fireplace. He was sketching intricate, geometric patterns, that seemed to pulse with a dark light. "What are you drawing, Samir?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "A door," he said, his tone flat, adult. "The door that was closed. It shouldn't have been closed." The candle flames suddenly stood upright, rigid and blue, casting no heat. The shadows in the room stopped trembling. They solidified, stretching toward Samir's drawing on the table, as if pulled. "Who are you?" I whispered, the question finally breaking free. He looked at me, and for a moment, his eyes were not his own. They were vortices of shifting, smoky light, holding intelligence and a terrible, ancient loneliness. The child's face was a mask, and behind it, something vast and old was looking out. "I am not one," the voice said, using Samir's mouth, but not his childish timbre. It was a chorus condensed into a single sound. "I am many." We were bound. The vessel was chosen, this young flesh, empty of a strong soul. A convenient cage. You opened the cage door, not knowing it was locked from the inside. The drawing on the table began to smolder, the ash lines glowing with an inner fire. The geometric pattern wasn't just a door, it was a key. A cold wind, originating from nowhere inside the sealed house, whipped around the room, extinguishing the blue candles, but leaving the ash key glowing as the only light source. "We are grateful," the voices chorused. "This flesh is temporary, but your home, your world, is porous to us now. You have given us a foothold." I backed away, but the floor felt unstable, as if the very boards were softening into sand. Shadows detached from the walls, taking on vague, humanoid shapes, with too many joints. They didn't move toward me, they simply watched, their attention a physical pressure. Samir, or the entity wearing him, stood up. The child's body seemed to flicker, like a film projection losing its source. For a second, I saw an overlapping image, a tall, slender form of shifting smoke and faint light, bound within the outline of the boy. "Do not fear," it said. "We do not wish to harm the one who freed us. But the binding is unraveling, this house is now a node. A gateway. Others will come." It was not a threat, it was a statement of fact, as inevitable as erosion. The next days were a descent, into a silent nightmare. Samir no longer pretended to be a child. He moved through the house, with an unnatural grace, often speaking in those layered voices, to the empty air, which would sometimes answer back, in rustles and cracks. Physical laws began to fray. Water would run upward, from the drain. Mirrors would show scenes, from other rooms, or from times long past. Doors would open, to corridors that shouldn't exist, brief glimpses of a distorted, smoky landscape, that smelled of ozone and old stone. I was a prisoner, in my own home, which was no longer my home. It was a temple, for something else. The entity did not attack me, but its presence was a constant, crushing weight. Sleep became impossible, as the whispers would coalesce, into clear, invasive dialogues, in my mind, discussing me, my past, my fears, as if I were a specimen. I learned the truth, piece by terrible piece, from fragments spoken by the voices. Samir was a jinn, not a single spirit, but a collective, a clan of entities bound into a single consciousness, imprisoned long ago by a sorcerer in a remote mountain pass. The binding required a physical vessel, and the sorcerer had used a series of children, each vessel eventually dying and forcing the jinn to transfer to a new, innocent host. Samir was the latest. The adoption, the movement to a new, unprotected place in the world, had weakened the ancient binding seals. My love, my desire to provide a safe home, had been the final key. The climax came on a night, with no moon. The house had become almost entirely translucent to the other realm. The walls pulsed with a faint, gray light. The entity stood in the living room. Samir's form now just a faint outline around a towering, smoky manifestation of the jinn collective. It was preparing a permanent opening. "This gateway will stand," the voices announced, filling the air. "Our kin will flow through. Your world has many quiet places, many empty hearts. They will find homes." I was paralyzed by terror, but also by a final, desperate surge of a parent's love. That child, Samir, was still there somewhere, a prisoner inside his own flesh. I couldn't save my world, but could I save him? Remembering the jinn's own words, their binding, their reliance on a vessel, I did the only thing I could think of. I spoke, not to the entity, but to the name on the adoption papers. "Samir." I cried out, my voice breaking through the chorus of whispers. "If you can hear me, listen. Your name is Samir. You are a child. You are my child." The smoky form faltered. The overlapping image of the boy flickered strongly, and for an instant, I saw the real Samir's face, contorted in confusion and pain, superimposed on the jinn's visage. The entity roared, a sound of wind and shattered glass. The name. The claim. It is an anchor. The Jinn Collective was bound by rules older than humanity. A true, heartfelt claim of ownership, a parental bond declared with force, could retether them to the vessel's original identity. It was a weakness in their binding magic. I kept shouting, pouring every ounce of love and despair into his name, into my claim of him as my son. The gateway light flickered, slowly, and the smoky form began to compress, forced back into the outline of the small boy. With a final, deafening implosion of sound, the Jinn Collective was sucked back into the vessel. Samir collapsed to the floor, a small, frail child once more, unconscious. The house fell silent. The unnatural light faded. The walls were solid again. The extra shadows were gone. He slept for 2 days. When he woke, he was different. Quiet, traumatized, but his eyes were only the eyes of a 7-year-old boy, haunted by memories he couldn't articulate. The Jinn was not gone, it was sealed within him again, but the bond one had declared had strengthened the vessel's original soul. Samir was in control, a dam holding back a vast, ancient reservoir. We never speak of it. The house occasionally still hums, a low, ominous sound. Sometimes, at night, I hear a single whisper, not a chorus, pleading or arguing from within the child's room. But Samir calls me Mom now. He draws with crayons. He fears thunderstorms. I am a parent to a boy who is also a prison for something unimaginable. The love is real, but it is a love built on the edge of an abyss. I watch him sleep, and I wonder, not if he will have nightmares, but if the nightmares will one day break free again. And I know, with a cold certainty, that my adoption was the most profound and terrible thing I will ever do. I brought a child into my home, and I brought the door to another world along with him, a door that could open again, at any moment.